Recent developments around Ukraine, the United States, Russia, and the European Union seem to be building into a crescendo of diplomatic maneuvers. It all began with that marathon meeting in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where top officials from Washington and Moscow spent more than 4 hours trying to outline a path to end the Ukraine conflict. A conflict that has dragged on since early 2022, with no simple resolution in sight. The very fact that the two sides met in person after years of near-total disconnection is already noteworthy, because previously, there was little but tense phone calls, cautious statements, and the occasional exchange through third parties. Now, in Riyadh, they finally sat down at a table in Diriyah Palace, surrounded by Saudi hosts, talking face-to-face about how to reduce tensions, explore economic cooperation, and maybe even set the stage for a future summit between Presidents Trump and Putin. On the American side, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz took point, joined by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, while Russia brought Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Foreign Policy Advisor Yuri Yushakov, plus Kirill Dmitriev, the investment fund director, whose appearance signaled that financial matters might also be on the menu. According to observers, the initial atmosphere was thick with apprehension, but after 2 separate sessions and a short lunch break, the mood softened a bit. A few jokes were exchanged, and while no major breakthrough was announced, both delegations hinted that they had a better grasp of each other's positions. The crux of the disagreement remains how Ukraine factors into this conversation. President Zelensky was not invited, nor was any European representative, which triggered a wave of concern back in Kyiv and across European capitals. Zelensky even postponed a scheduled trip to Saudi Arabia, proclaiming that Ukraine would never accept any agreement hammered out in its absence, particularly when rumors swirl of Russian demands that question his legitimacy, since his 5-year term ended in 2024 but was effectively extended through martial law. On top of that, President Trump has suggested that maybe Ukraine needs to hold fresh elections soon, pointing to Zelensky's falling approval ratings and insinuating that the current leadership might lack a mandate to negotiate the future of the country. A stance that aligns with Russia's skepticism about whether Zelensky is truly authorized to sign off on major concessions. Meanwhile, Europe's reaction has been a mix of dismay and determination. EU leaders fear they are being sidelined by a direct US-Russia channel, reminiscent of the Cold War era, so they have threatened to wield what they call an iron fist in a velvet glove if Trump proceeds with any new tariffs on steel, aluminum, or other imports. Memories of his first term's sweeping tariffs have apparently motivated the European Commission to toughen its trade defense arsenal. Talk of retaliatory duties on iconic American products like jeans, motorcycles, or bourbon is already swirling, and digital regulations that target US tech giants might provide Brussels with yet another potent lever if the situation escalates. Of course, the Trump administration's position is that tariffs are merely reciprocal, that is, if the EU imposes or maintains what he considers unfair trade barriers, the US will respond in kind. It all raises the specter of a serious trade war, which could hit consumer prices, supply chains, and economic growth on both sides of the Atlantic, precisely at a moment when global markets are already uneasy about extended conflicts and geopolitical uncertainty. Then, there's the question of Ukraine's rare mineral resources, something that has emerged as a potential bargaining chip. Certain American officials have floated the idea of gaining partial ownership or exploitation rights over those resources, possibly as a means for Ukraine to repay the billions of dollars in weaponry and support that Washington has poured in since 2022. Needless to say, Ukrainian authorities bristle at this prospect, calling it an infringement on national sovereignty, a rushed attempt to commercialize a brutal war, and an arrangement that might undermine genuine reconstruction in the long term. All these moving pieces, from the potential sidelining of Europe in key negotiations, to the possibility that the US might link troop withdrawal or ceasefire guarantees to economic deals, and the overarching tension over Zelensky's political future, create a highly complex puzzle. Russia, of course, insists that Ukraine should stay out of NATO and that the West should recognize Moscow's strategic security interests, which includes halting further eastward expansion of the alliance. The US and its allies tend to reject that ultimatum, but if the White House is now pursuing a new line of diplomacy, Europe wonders if that might imply a tacit acceptance of some Russian demands. Meanwhile, back in the States, there's a swirl of gossip about Elon Musk and a purported 13th child with writer Ashley Sinclair, which, while it may be a headline grabber in certain tabloids, pales in relevance compared to the staggering stakes involved in the Ukraine crisis. yet it demonstrates how easily attention can pivot away from global issues to personal stories. Overall, the direct dialogue in Riyadh, though overshadowed by complaints from Kyiv and Brussels, might still hold the seeds of de-escalation, at least if President Trump and President Putin can meet and craft a framework that ends the bloodshed on terms acceptable to all major stakeholders. But no matter how the White House frames these negotiations, it cannot ignore the fact that Zelensky is still recognized as Ukraine's head of state by most of the international community, or that the EU is a formidable economic actor capable of retaliating if it feels sidelined or disadvantaged. Observers say the next steps will involve setting up a more formal roadmap, drafting potential conditions for a ceasefire, and clarifying Russia's demands on Ukraine's neutral status. That might come alongside discussion of new elections in Ukraine, or at least a debate over whether Zelensky truly maintains broad support. It seems the timeline for any Trump-Putin summit is still up in the air. No date has been confirmed, no official joint statement has been released, and the unanswered question is whether the eventual arrangement can satisfy the myriad interests involved, including the Ukrainian people themselves, whose daily lives have been devastated by this conflict. In parallel, if the Trump administration and the EU fail to settle their trade disputes, we may see a flurry of mutual tariffs that complicate an already fragile global economy. So the stakes are huge: peace in Eastern Europe, economic stability, the integrity of international norms, and the leadership of Zelensky, who either must be included in the talks or might face a crisis of legitimacy if the US and Russia rewrite the terms on their own. This swirl of diplomatic maneuvering has many analysts holding their breath, worried that a miscalculation or a side deal cut behind closed doors could unleash new waves of discord. But at least, for now, direct engagement is happening, which is more than could be said for recent years of cold standoffs and rhetorical crossfire. All eyes remain on the next moves by Washington, Moscow, Kyiv, and Brussels, with Saudi Arabia apparently willing to host further meetings, determined to boost its profile as a serious peace broker, while Ukrainian officials insist that no final agreement can stand unless their voice and their sovereignty is respected in the final text. The international community waits to see whether compromise is feasible or if we are simply witnessing the opening act of yet another geopolitical drama, one in which major powers vie for influence while Ukraine and Europe grapple with the consequences.